Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you all on this first Sunday of Advent as we are beginning together what we are calling our season of blessing. Really, in this Advent season, trying to focus on not so much what we receive this Christmas season, but what we give and how we can be a blessing to others. And so this morning I want to begin with our scripture reading. It's taken from the Gospel of John, chapter 4, verses 27 through 34. I invite you to follow along with me if you'd like. Or just listen in. Just then, his disciples, of course being Jesus' disciples, returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. But no one asked him, "What do you want?" or "Why are you talking to her?" Then, leaving her water jug, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, "Come and see a man who told me everything I've ever done. Could this be the Messiah?" They came from out of the town and made their way towards him. Meanwhile, the disciples urged him, saying, "Rabbi, eat something." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you do not know about." Then his disciples said to each other, "Could someone have brought him food?" "My food," Jesus said, "is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work." May God add his blessing to this, the reading of his holy word. And so it begins today. We launch into a new season of Advent, which means that Christmas is right around the corner. It's a little bit hard for me to believe. It seems like summer was just starting, and here we are again, diving into a new Advent season. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we want this season this year to be what we're calling this season of blessing. Now, Advent is a season of preparation. It's preparing for the coming of Christ. And it's a chance for us to kind of focus on that. And so I wanted to ask you this morning, how do you prepare for the coming of Christ? What kinds of things do we do to prepare for Christmas? The fact is that most of us put some significant work into preparing for Christmas. And so what does that look like to you in your family, in your household? What does it look like for your family to prepare for Christmas? Often those preparations fall into three categories. The big three, you might call them. We prepare with shopping, decorating, and food. Those are usually the three. We've got Christmas gifts to get, and so we're out there shopping, or maybe you shop online, so you're at your computer looking over the websites and picking things out and placing your order, or you go out to the mall and you fight the crowd, and so you prepare for Christmas by doing all that shopping. And many of us decorate our homes. Maybe you're Chevy Chase in Christmas Vacation. You're out there with 1,000 lights on the side of your house and all that kind of stuff. And so you prepare with that. And many of us prepare with food. Often the holidays are marked by Christmas goodies and by special meals and family gatherings. And food always seems to be at the heart of that. And so today, I want us to focus on the third one. Today, I want us to focus on this whole topic of food. And so let's talk about that a little bit. Let's give that some thought, because I don't think we realize sometimes what a significant role food plays in our lives. It actually is huge. It's enormous. We don't realize how much time, energy, attention is given to food. I mean, have you ever really stopped to think about, calculate out how much of your life, how much time in a given day or week is spent in thinking about, planning your meals, going shopping for your food, preparing the food, cooking, and then spent eating and cleaning up? If you really sat down and calculated, I bet you'd find that a good bit of your day, in one way or another, goes into something food related. The reality is we put a lot of time and thought and energy and effort into our food. Then as a culture, if you add to that things like restaurants, how much money, real estate, time, energy, marketing, advertising, how much goes into restaurants? And then, on top of that, think about cooking shows, perhaps, and news columns and cookbooks and all these other things that we do that in some way are related to food. And then, on top of that, we just spend time talking about it and thinking about it. If you put all that stuff together, the stuff we do in our own homes to repair, and then the stuff we do out in society that is in some way food related, it's a big part of our life. Food is a big part of our lives. When you get right down to it, we give a lot of attention to food. In fact, to some extent, in some situations, you might even say that we're obsessed with it. I mean, I've known people who, that's a big part of their daily conversation. They start on the morning figuring out what they're going to have for breakfast, and before long they're already thinking about or talking about what they're going to do about lunch and where are we going to go, what are we going to pick up, and then all this time and energy gone into planning dinner or restaurants we're going to visit or whatever. We have a cultural almost obsession with food. Now, I suppose to some extent that's probably good. That's probably okay. Because the reality is we need food. We need to eat. If we do not consume food, we will not have the energy we need to live. Our bodies will not grow, will not be nourished, they will not be healthy if we don't eat. So I sort of get it. I sort of understand why food is such a big deal to us. But I sometimes think we're preoccupied with it. I sometimes think that maybe we've become too caught up with it. And honestly, I think to some extent we've probably taken it further than it really needs to go. And we've probably become more interested in it than is necessary. And if we're honest, most of us probably get more food than we need. Many of us in America eat more food than we really need to live. And you know how I know that? Because you know what the other national obsession is besides food? Any thought? Dieting. We're almost as obsessed with dieting as we are with eating. And so we spend all this time and energy thinking about what we're going to eat, and then we spend all this other time and energy thinking about how we're going to lose the weight that we gained from all the food we ate. So obviously we're eating more food than we need when in the United States, dieting is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And so here we've got this odd dichotomy where we're obsessed with food and then we're obsessed with losing the weight that comes from it. And so for many, food has become a big deal in our lives. And for us as Christians, I think there's some significance to that. I think it's important that we notice that. Because truthfully, I think there are some spiritual issues beneath all of this. I think there are some faith implications to our preoccupation with food. I think there are really at least two big faith issues when it comes to food and eating and all that. And one of them is spiritual, and one of them is practical. Now, the spiritual issue, I think, is actually illustrated somewhat for us in this story we read. In this story from John, where, if you know the part leading up to it, you know that the disciples had stopped at this well. They were resting at this well, and they had gone into town to get some food, but Jesus stayed there. And the Samaritan woman comes, and he ends up in this conversation back and forth, and you know that whole story. And that's a whole nother story, in a way. It's a whole other message, in a way. But when they come back, and they offer to give Jesus some food, in fact, more than offer, they urge him to eat. Does that sound like anybody's home? Oh, have something to eat. As if we always need to have something to eat, like it's somehow, integral, beyond just being hungry. Whether you're hungry or not, they'll say, well, I have something to eat. So Jesus says, no, I don't need anything to eat. And so they're trying to insist. And so he says to them this curious thing. He says, I have food that you do not know about. And they're all scratching their heads thinking, did somebody else bring him food? How did he get food? Did this woman have some food? Jesus says, no, I'm talking about a different kind of food. What nourishes me, what feeds me, is doing the will of my Father. And so Jesus has shown them a picture here. He has drawn for them this comparison of physical hunger and spiritual hunger, physical nourishment and spiritual nourishment. And to me, this is one of the spiritual issues for us when it comes to our whole obsession with food. You see, I believe there is within every one of us spiritual hunger. You know, every one of us, and we've heard this described in different ways, but every one of us is born with a longing within us. Something that is not settled until it is found in Christ. And what I've found is that in our culture, often people have inner hungers, which are really spiritual hungers, and yet they try to feed them with material things. And for some people, our obsession with food is really a spiritual issue. In some ways, our obsession with food is our desire, our longing to somehow fill this inner hunger that we have that actually has nothing to do with food, physical food. And yet we strive to fill that space. We strive to fill that place within us that is hungering. And Jesus says there's a difference between physical food and spiritual food. And yet we sometimes try to feed ourselves meeting a spiritual need with a physical thing. You know, a while back we offered a Bible study at St. Matt's in the Rock. It's called Made to Crave. And it really is a study that is all about food and why we eat, what we eat, and the fact, sort of helping us recognize that sometimes we're trying to feed inward things externally. Sometimes we eat for the wrong reasons. We eat because something's missing, something's longing inside of us, not that we're physically hungry. And so there's a spiritual issue here, and that's not just food. I mean, I realize there are other ways that we do this. We sometimes for some people, addictions are an attempt to try to feed something inward. For many people, misplaced relationships are an attempt to feed an inner hunger that isn't being met, a spiritual need that is within our lives. And for some people, it is food that we're trying to comfort or feel something, satisfy something inward that really cannot be fed with hunger. And so that whole study, that Made to Crave study, was really about helping us, those who participated, I didn't do it, but I heard about it, helping us turn that longing for physical food, or what we think we're getting when we eat, into a hunger for Christ. Into recognizing that the only way we're ever really going to fill that inward longing, that inward hunger, is in Christ, is in nourishing it spiritually. So part of the spiritual issue for Christians is that I think we've allowed ourselves to become preoccupied with things of this world, including food, seeking to fill something else. Something that is really taking the place of what should be our hunger for God. And so part of what I want us to think about today, as we think about this obsession with food and all the preoccupation we have with that, is that maybe some of that is misdirected spiritually. Maybe some of that is really intended to be a hunger for Christ, is intended to be something that is fed spiritually. So there is this spiritual component to this obsession we have culturally with food. But as I said a minute ago, there's also a practical component for us as Christians. And that practical component is the issue of need and abundance. Do you understand what I mean by that? Let me say that again. The practical component of the issue of food in our lives is the issue of need and abundance. And that is the recognition that in our world, there are people who are in need of food. And there are people who have abundance of food. And for us as Christians, that is a spiritual issue. When there are some people who have so much food that they have to diet, and there are some people who don't have enough food to even get through the day, that's a spiritual issue. That is a faith issue. That is something that as Christians, we ought to be concerned about. There ought to be something about that that bothers us. When billions of dollars are spent on dieting, and yet millions of people go hungry, there's a disconnect there that as Christians, we ought to be concerned about. That ought to somehow speak to our lives. Let me share with you a couple of statistics. Worldwide, 860 million people in this world. That number is so large you can't even really grasp it. But that's like almost 3 times the population of the United States. 860 million people in this world are malnourished. That is to say, they consistently do not have enough food for their body to do what it needs to do, just to process, just to live. They really don't have enough food to even live on. 6 million children die every year of starvation. They have so little food and are so malnourished that they literally die for a lack of enough food to eat. Now, that's worldwide, of course, but even here in the United States, hunger is a significant issue. I don't think we think of it that way. I don't think we realize that right here in our own country it's an issue, but it is. I caught a little piece of an ABC report a while back, and I want to show you just a little clip from it that describes a little bit of the issue. If you would, turn your attention to the screen for a minute.
Across ABC News to call attention to another crisis in America, hunger here at home. Millions of people across this country simply don't have enough to eat. Nearly everywhere, take a look. The areas in brightest red on this map are where the hunger crisis is most severe. And the organization Feeding America has given us an exclusive first look at stunning new findings. 1 in 6 Americans and 1 out of every 4 children start each day not knowing if they will have the food they need.
In every corner of the country, a portrait of hidden hunger now emerging. The recession has pushed 2.4 million more children into poverty. 17 million children are now food insecure, meaning their parents often don't know where the next meal is coming from. Simply put, 1 in 4 American children don't have enough food.
And that's one thing we found as we traveled this country, that couple in Arkansas, both with jobs, Jazir's mother going back to school to get a better job, and still these families having a hard time putting food on the table. George, that number is worth repeating. 1 in 4 American children now from families that simply don't know sometimes where that next meal is coming from.
Folks, this is a faith issue. This is an issue that as Christians we ought to be concerned about. I believe that as long as God has been communicating with his people, he has been instructing us to be concerned about this issue, to recognize that there are those who go hungry, and to be sure that we who have enough share with those who do not. If you go all the way back to the beginning, the Pentateuch, to the book of Deuteronomy. I'm going to turn quickly. You don't have to follow me, but if you want to, you can. Chapter 14, verses 28 and 29. I'm going to need my glasses. Here he wrote, at the end of every 3 years, this is God instructing them, bring all the tithes of that year produced and store it in your towns, so that the Levites, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, and the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied. So from early on, God was saying, set aside some of your tithe in order to feed the hungry. Certainly the Levites, we talked about that the way we talked about stewardship, but also for those who are fatherless, the widows, the orphans, those who do not have enough. Also in Luke chapter 3, verse 11, John the Baptist said, John answered them when they asked him, what shall we do? He's crying out to them for righteousness. What shall we do? John answers, anyone who has 2 shirts should share one with those who have none. And anyone who has food should do the same. And he was very direct. If you've got enough food and you know somebody doesn't, then you ought to be sharing that food. And then in James, you know James, you got to love James. I mean, he is just so direct, so pointed in what he says. In James chapter 2, verses 15 and 16, he says, suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm, be well fed, but does nothing about their physical need, what good is it? Basically, what kind of faith is that? What kind of faith is it if you see someone's in need and you say to them, have a great day, be well fed, but you don't do anything to help them? James comes right out and says that's not faith. He says, you say you have faith, I'll show you my faith by my deeds. That our faith in God ought to be reflected in obedience to what he teaches us, and that is to care for those who do not have enough. There are always going to be people in the world who, because of their circumstances in life, don't have enough. Don't have enough to even eat to get through the day. And so I think the Bible is pretty clear to us that this whole issue of food at a practical level is a faith issue. That God instructs us to be concerned for those who do not have enough. Now, am I suggesting that this Christmas season you shouldn't bake Christmas cookies, or you shouldn't have great family meals where there's an abundance of food? Am I saying that that's bad or wrong? Absolutely not. It's not my point at all. But what my point is that if we have enough, then we should be sharing. If we've got enough food that we can have Christmas cookies and we can put on great feasts for our family, then we ought to be able to squeeze out some to share with those who don't have enough. Abundance and need. Most of us are living with relative abundance compared to the rest of the world. Most of us have more food than what we need to survive. And so if we're in that place of having enough food, and probably some to spare, then I believe God is saying to us that we ought to be sharing it. We ought to find ways to make sure that those around us also have enough. That if we've got food for today, then we ought to bless someone who doesn't. Now, you know, we hear that number, 860 million people in the world who are malnourished, and we think, what can I possibly do? What difference can I possibly make? It's just too big a problem. And often we've sort of justified doing nothing by saying that we can't do everything. And so what I want to say to us today is let's start right here. Let's make the decision that at least in our town, our community, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that children don't go to bed hungry tonight. We're going to do everything we can to make sure that some of our abundance gets shared with those who are in need. I dream of a day when at least within our circle of reach, and then we can reach out beyond and collectively with a larger world community make a difference in beyond our own community. But let's start with just saying, let's see what we can do, something intentional right here now. Let's do something that makes a difference for the people, the children in our own community who are going to go to bed hungry tonight. And there are children in our community who will go to bed hungry tonight. So let's do something about that. Now, I have been talking this up for a little while, and I really have asked us to treat this season of Advent as a season of blessing. A season when we can bless others because we have been blessed. And so here's what I want to do. I'm going to close us in prayer, and then we'll go into our closing song. And as we sing our closing song, I'm going to invite you to come forward with the gifts of food that you've brought with you. And I know that many of you have brought with you. I warned you, I tried to let you know ahead of time so you could do this. Brought with you actual food items with you today. If you didn't know, if you don't have anything with you, there's also going to be a basket behind me. And, just throw a few bucks in the basket when we use it to buy milk and bread and the kinds of things we can't store at the food pantry as people come. But I believe every one of us has something we can share. And if we all do that, I believe we can make a difference in the needs of the people in the world around us. Would you join me in prayer? Lord, you have blessed us abundantly. And we are a culture, Lord, that really gives a lot of attention to food. Maybe beyond what is appropriate sometimes. And sometimes we become obsessed with it. And sometimes we've consumed more than we've needed to the point where now dieting has become this big industry, Lord. And so, God, I pray that you would help us, first of all, to recognize if there's something spiritual that we're lacking, that we're struggling with, that we would not seek to fill that with things of this world, be it food or some other area of addiction or shopping or power or whatever. But I also pray at a very practical level that if we have more than we need, that we would be generous and that we would give back, bring to you, bring to the altar food that can be used for others, that can make a difference in the lives of those who are hungry. And so, Lord, receive this, our offering of love, in the name of Christ, for the sake of those in need. I pray in Jesus' holy name. Amen.